Among the popular icons of Spanish America, who are the embodiment of both the Castilian knight and the Andalusian bandit, few have had the luck of the young martyrdom that enshrines them forever in history and protects them from criticism. Such is the case of Emiliano Zapata Salazar, the man turned into a myth of the Mexican Revolution and of the peasant flags. From a small town in the south of Mexico was born the figure who would be key in the collapse of the historic regime of General Porfirio Diaz. But what are the facts behind the myth? What was the story that brought him the title of the Attila of the South? Who was the man behind the hero who would become a symbol for millions? Join us until the end of this video to learn about the life of Emiliano Zapata. Reynaldo Carrillo speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia. And you can support our channel simply by liking this video, leaving a comment, sharing it with your acquaintances, and supporting us on Patreon, which you can find below in the comments. Among the villas of the state of Morelos, an arid and relatively infertile land in the heart of Mexico, where the vibrant tapestry of culture weaves its spell, and the bustling markets pulse with the life of commerce. In the midst of the hot, dense air stood one of the haciendas that cradled Emiliano Zapata Salazar in his upbringing years, who comes into the world within a Catholic family, in the village of Anenecuilco on the 8th of August, 1879. Being the son of Gabriel Zapata, a successful horse breeder, and Cleophas Gertrudis Salazar, a selfless housewife. Contrary to popular belief, the Zapata family were small landowners settled in their homeland. They lived in a large house, which contrasted with the huts of the other inhabitants of those villages where time seemed to have stopped. This was the era of the Porfiriato in Mexico, after decades of internal struggles between liberals and conservatives. In 1877, the veteran general Porfirio Diaz takes power and manages to pacify the country. He establishes an autocratic government based on a positivist philosophy, which brought the country a period of political and economic stability that had not been experienced since the viceroyal era. However, the progress of modernity does not come to Mexico without traumas and costs. Porfirio Diaz carries out a policy of industrialization of agriculture with foreign capital and the acquisition of lands considered idle or poorly worked. This meant the dispossession of numerous local communities of estates that had historically belonged to indigenous groups, or to small landowners, who in some cases had never been granted official ownership papers. When it's Emiliano's father's turn, and the landowners expropriate the Zapata's estates, who were the hereditary owners of these lands that they tilled with their own hands. This ignites Emiliano's passion for justice, and the seed of the peasant flag that he would raise later throughout his life, the flag that the land belongs to the one who works it. Being only a child after his lands were expropriated, and hearing his father's lamentations saying that nothing could be done, the young Zapata responds, "It can't be done? Well, when I grow up, I will make them return it." Emiliano leaves his studies. At 16, his father and mother both die from illness. Zapata's life took a turn, and although he was left an orphan, the military courage that had shown through his parents' family history remained more than intact. In Zapata, his maternal grandfather, Jose Salazar, joined the ranks of the hero's army. Jose Maria Morelos, the namesake of Zapata's and his parents' home state, and on his father's side, where Emiliano had two uncles, Cristino and Jose. They fought in Juarez's Reform War and against the French intervention in Mexico. This combative lineage and circumstances would lead Emiliano on a path of leadership, first commercial and then military. Emiliano Zapata developed a rural work ethic instilled by his parents in Anenecuilco. He worked tilling the hectares, properties of his family and some more from the surrounding estates. In times of drought, he also transported loads on mules along the banks of the Cuautla and also bought and sold livestock. Unlike his countrymen, he was not very fond of drinking, and when he did, it was to relax rather than to get rowdy. The surrounding towns of Morelos and Anenecuilco all the way to the outskirts of Mexico City. Zapata established business relationships, managing to accumulate a considerable amount of money, but due to his orphanhood, the locals of his hometown did not hold him in high regard. Beyond the saddles, the elaborate clothes, and the body adornments, they nicknamed him Milito, a nickname that he disliked. For the time, Anenecuilco was a town whose demographics were composed of mestizos and indigenous people, Spanish-speaking and Nahuatl-speaking. Zapata, to maintain commercial and daily contact, learns the Nahuatl language, and it is through this that he becomes even more familiar with the indigenous groups that protested when the landowners took or threatened to take control of the local lands. With the precedent of the expropriation of his parents' lands, Zapata becomes quite involved in the movements of the communities in the state of Morelos that sought reparations against land seizures. Here begins Zapata's rise as a local leader, and it is in these spaces that the young man develops a charisma and a persuasive ability that easily earned him the trust of his countrymen. At that stage, a delegation from the judiciary meets with Zapata and other peasant leaders in search of conflict resolution. But their intentions turned treacherous as they arrested Zapata at one of these meetings and his companions. And in doing so, they forced them to become conscripts of the federal army. So that in 1908, Zapata is incorporated into the 9th Cavalry Regiment and eventually ends up under the command of Ignacio de la Torre, son-in-law of General Porfirio Diaz, who develops a special friendship with Emiliano for his skill and knowledge with horses. Only through the favors of Porfirio's son-in-law is Zapata able to avoid the rest of the military service, for he goes to work at the son-in-law's hacienda as a horse breeder. His military service, coupled with connections to the compadres of Porfirio Diaz's son-in-law, provided him the opportunity to do business with local landowners who needed a reliable supplier of horses. With his new experience, Emiliano thrives, accumulates wealth, and leads a comfortable life. He wore the attire of a charro with black cashmere pants with silver buttons, a wide charro hat, a Dutch jacket, Mosaqueña spurs, and a pistol on his waist. It is said that Zapata was a man with a personality that was often very serious and even introverted, with an intimidating gaze, and at other times a personality that never stopped making jokes and pranks, even in delicate battle situations. His thick, long mustache and his always challenging attitude gave him the nickname of the archetype of the Mexican macho. During his life, he slept with many women, having more than 10 children, and even in the memoirs of Porfirio Diaz's son-in-law's wife, there are talks of alleged relationships of Zapata with other men, including with Porfirio's own son-in-law. The second half of the 19th century and the Porfiriato brought rapid modernization to the province of Morelos, where Anenecuilco was located, a process marked by the arrival of railways, steam centrifuges, and previously quiet haciendas, which turned into bustling factories that produced a third of Mexican sugar, rivaling in production and profits many of the mills in the region. On the other hand, as we have mentioned, this industrialization and development concentrated land ownership in the hands of a few families, often leaving the less fortunate displaced to less fertile lands. In the late Porfiriato era, tensions rose between hacienda owners and local communities in Morelos after Governor Manuel Alarcon's death. In 1909, the hacienda owners sought a new governor who would be aligned with the interests of Porfirio Diaz. Porfirio was already suffering the natural wear and tear of being in power for more than 30 years. The extensive network of loyalties around him was beginning to show cracks, and more sectors, both inside and outside of Mexico, were asking him to leave the presidency and call for free elections. Porfirio made some notable statements to the press in which he announced that at the end of his term he would call for elections and give freedom to political parties. The succession of Porfirio Diaz had become a state matter, and the so-called scientists and other power groups that accompanied him could not agree on a successor. Inspired by these statements from Diaz, which promised political openness, local leaders in Morelos, faced with the death of the governor, promote the candidate, Patricio Leiva. Leiva was supported by Emiliano Zapata, and this was his first foray into politics by opposing Porfirio Diaz's favorite candidate for February of 1909. Local leaders had hopes in Leiva's election. But Diaz used every possible mechanism to twist the process in his favor and ensure the victory of Pablo Escandon to the governorship, who was his candidate. The Porfirian government of Escandon raised taxes and favored the forced takeover of lands that interested the landowners, whose machinery would make the work of the land more efficient. He also does it as a threat that if the locals voted again against the Porfiriato, the consequences would be the loss of their properties and even their way of life. But few knew that these actions were about to awaken the indomitable character of one of the leaders who would leave the most mark on the popular imagination of America. Various elements came together to make Zapata finally rise up in arms. In addition to the economic situation of the small state of Morelos, Zapata is chosen in 1909. As Calpuleque, a word in Anahuac that means leader, they name him Calpuleque, from a land defense meeting in Anenecuilco, where all the locals gathered their property titles, their documents, and other legal papers that even dated back to the viceroyalty era and were denied by the reform laws and the Lerdo law from the old liberal governments. Zapata gathers all these titles and looks for lawyers in Mexico City to enforce the property rights of his constituents. But the judicial system, arranged in favor of the interests of the status quo, makes this effort through legal means useless in the face of the institutional refusal of the state. In Zapata, finally, the atavistic flashes of old Hispanic anarchism and individualism, characteristic of the man who knows no other law than his own, emerge. And along with the locals, he decides to take up arms to reclaim the lands they claimed as their own. With 80 horsemen armed to the teeth, in 1910 they go against a landowner who had expanded the boundaries of his property. With a fence and at gunpoint they destroy the fence, scare off the overseers, and threaten the landowner. After these events, Zapata is declared by the authorities as a bandit or outlaw and has to flee to the mountains to avoid being captured. But what happened in Morelos was just a skirmish, because in the rest of Mexico, the opposition to the Porfiriato was beginning to realize that Porfirio Diaz would be re-elected once again and that he was not going to fulfill the promises he made of succession and free elections. By 1910, a wealthy liberal named Francisco Madero runs in the election against Porfirio Diaz. Madero gathers significant support. The Porfiriato feels threatened and politically disables him, throwing him into a dungeon. Given the popular support for Madero, he is helped to escape to the United States. Once in San Antonio, Texas, Madero decides that if Porfirio Diaz would not leave power through votes, his opponents should force him to leave by means of bullets. So in October of 1910, he proclaims the Plan of San Luis, a manifesto that called the Mexican people to arms against the Porfiriato. Madero was relatively isolated in the United States, but among the few who paid attention to such a clamor, there was a bandit turned famous revolutionary leader named Francisco Pancho Villa, a man who preferred to solve problems quickly and with a gun in hand, and who decides to join Madero's revolution against Porfirio. On his part, when Emiliano Zapata learns of Francisco Madero's revolutionary proclamation, he is particularly struck by the fact that among his reforms, he proposed the return of lands expropriated by the landowners. Zapata, who was in the South, decides, along with his partners, to send a delegate to meet with Madero in Texas, representing the local leaders. For 1911, Madero returns to Mexico to seek control with many men and begins to wage war on the armed forces of Porfirio Diaz. However, Madero, lacking ideological content, with a government plan that was largely limited to the renegotiation of land distribution between landowners and peasants, was not able to gather enough wills, because the common denominator of the revolutionaries was simply aversion to the Porfiriato. However, during the Lent of March 10, 1911, something would change this reality. Zapata and his men, after deliberations, finally decide to adhere to Madero's revolution, and from the town of Cuautla, they also proclaimed the Maderista Plan of San Luis. Zapata goes south to recruit new troops and achieves significant victories in battles against the Porfirian forces. Between April and May, Pancho Villa and his forces capture the city of Juarez in the north. the troops of Emiliano Zapata invoke a more radical and demanding agenda. Inspired by Teodoro Flores's phrase, "The land belongs to those who work it," which became a battle cry. An ethos unacceptable to the so-called scientists and other groups of the Porfiriato who looked down on the anarchy of the insurgency that Zapata in the south and Villa in the north were leading. Zapata builds the core of his army from family loyalties and compadrazgos among the agricultural groups in the area. At the top of his army were his brother, cousins, and old partners from the region. And soon he begins to be recognized by the rebels from other towns as the main leader of the revolution to the south. Emiliano Zapata sets up his headquarters in Cuautlisco, attacks the 5th Regiment of the Porfirian Army, and now with thousands of men takes Huehuetlan in Puebla in May. With the death of several revolutionary commanders, including Torres Burgos, Zapata is named the Maderista revolutionary leader of the South. His effectiveness in combat and his personality are spreading Zapata's fame as a leader of the peasants throughout the country. His fame is so great that in 1911, the Porfirian government receives news that in the south of Mexico, even the dogs were Zapatistas. Zapata's troops also committed all kinds of violence and cruelties typical of war. They looted and burned estates, kidnapped women, and wiped out some localities and their opponents in the cities. In the metropolis, they began to nickname him in the press as the Attila of the South. Without Zapata's singular military, political, and social leadership, without his massive recruitment and his victories at this time, and without the peasant flags raised by the Zapatistas that gave greater political content to the revolution, those who took up arms against the Porfiriato would hardly have gained the strength and momentum they did at that time. The truth is that the troops of Zapata, Pancho Villa, and other Maderista groups managed to win in new battles against the Porfirian army. Porfirio Diaz, observing the impossible dangers to overcome in the north and the south, he makes some final arrangements for the time of his absence and decides on May 25, 1911, to resign from the presidency of Mexico and go into exile, along with more than 30 years in power. In Mexico, Porfirio leaves a series of failed interim presidents who try to organize new elections, but who show incompetence, as successors of Porfirianism to ensure cohesion and continuity. For Zapata, it was not enough that Francisco Madero was simply the new president in place of Diaz, but he wanted his troops to be recognized in exchange of weapons for the lands whose recovery was his flag from the beginning. But the new interim Porfirian presidents considered Zapata as a bandit and rebel, and rather increased the attack of the government troops against him. So Zapata heads to take shelter beyond Guerrero and beyond Puebla. During that time, he also marries Josefa Espejo, and the godfather of his wedding was Francisco Madero. Amidst the political turmoil with the absence of the main leader, the Porfiriato finally collapses, elections are held, and Francisco Madero becomes president. Now in power, Madero starts making agreements with oligarchy sectors opposed to the groups that originally brought him to power. And he offers Zapata a large estate to appease him, but Zapata refuses with a phrase for history. "No, Mr. Madero, I did not take up arms to conquer lands and estates. I took up arms so that the people of Morelos would have their stolen property returned. So then, Mr. Madero, either you fulfill what you promised to me in the state of Morelos, or we're both in deep trouble." He concludes the sentence with a threatening gesture, slamming Madero's desk with his .30-30 carbine. And so Zapata goes to regroup his forces and becomes a problem for the new president's government. In November of 1911, after considering that Madero had betrayed the peasant cause, Zapata proclaims the Plan of Ayala, which disavows President Madero and proposed an even broader agrarian reform. So the Zapatistas take up arms again. But shortly after, Francisco Madero is assassinated in a coup d'etat, and he is replaced by Victoriano Huerta, another figure opposed to Zapatismo, with whom they would now face off. Given the circumstances, Zapata was already leading the largest group of rebels in the region, armed with supplies and money. The Zapatistas are joined by Alvaro Obregón and Venustiano Carranza, who had weapons, money, and men, in Coahuila and Sonora. Thus begin new battles that are diminishing the faith of Victoriano Huerta's official military estate, which in addition, due to Woodrow Wilson's invasion of Veracruz, causes the withdrawal of many of the official troops to the north. In this way, the Zapatistas take control of Morelos. By the summer of 1915, the Zapatistas had taken the southern edge of the federal district, occupying Milpa Alta and Xochimilco. After repeated defeats, Victoriano de la Huerta resigned and fled. In 1914, the revolutionaries triumphantly enter Mexico, and political events lead to Venustiano Carranza being named as the new president of the nation. Carranza was an aristocrat with relevant political connections who won the support of Woodrow Wilson from Washington District of Columbia. And with that power, handsome and supported, just like his predecessor who pushed aside the peasant warlords without whom Venustiano would not have been crowned president, Carranza. He also seeks to push aside Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, who represented political and war actors that no one controlled. They are marginalized from the new government, despite their decisive contribution to Victoriano Huerta's downfall. Therefore, the Zapatistas, who are also considered by this government as uncultured savages, were set apart from everything. Peace treaty. And by 1915, there was a very tense peace in Morelos and the rest of the country. Pancho Villa rebels against the marginalization of Carranza's government, but was dominated by the government forces and discharged Venustiano Carranza. In power, did Zapata see his final significant threat? So he entrusts General Pablo Gonzalez to put an end to the Zapatista armed forces in Morelos, and they devise a plan to put an end to the leader of the South. So we are left with the outcome. Zapata, who always feared and repudiated betrayal, died as a result of a plot hatched by Colonel Jesus Guajardo, a subordinate of General Pablo Gonzalez, who was fighting for the government. A rumor of a conflict not wholly unreal between officers Guajardo and Gonzalez had reached Zapata's camp. Zapata writes to Guajardo inviting him to switch sides and join the Zapatista forces. General Gonzalez intercepts the letter, using it to spur and blackmail Guajardo, who sees it as a chance to prove his loyalty to the government. Guajardo deceives Zapata by affirmatively responding to the letter inviting him to switch sides. Zapata, always suspicious, first asks him to punish certain subordinates who had looted, killed, and abused women. To fulfill his mission, Colonel Guajardo kills 59 of his men to thus earn Zapata's trust. After that demonstration, Guajardo approaches Zapata and gives him a horse. The next step was the delivery of 12,000 cartridges to Zapata at the Chinameca Ranch. On the morning of April 10, 1919, the sun was rising over the fields surrounding the ranch. The wind was stirring up dust, and Zapata's mood was heated. Zapata was making rounds around the Chinameca Ranch. He doesn't take the bait. He's still suspicious, which is why he hasn't gone inside the ranch yet. Zapata's lieutenant was talking with Colonel Guajardo, who repeatedly invited Zapata to eat. Finally, under the scorching sun at 1 in the afternoon, Emiliano Zapata agrees to enter the place. On horseback with 10 men accompanying him, he heads towards the estate of the hacienda. The 10 followed him, shading themselves from the relentless sun under the trees with their rifles holstered. The guard at the gate of the hacienda house, formed to honor Zapata, prepares. The bugle plays the honor call 3 times. And as the last note fades, when General Emiliano Zapata arrives at the threshold of the door in the most treacherous, cowardly, and traitorous way, without giving time to draw their pistols, the soldiers presenting arms discharge their rifles twice at point-blank range and at the target, and General Zapata falls, never to rise again. The news spreads with surprise and sorrow throughout all of Mexico. Zapata had at some point written to his lieutenant, quote, "I must tell you that I will not see this revolution completed because the one who starts great causes does not see them finished," end quote. And as we mentioned at the beginning, not everyone suffers the fate of the young martyr, who in addition to the immunity of time offers the relief of rest. What would Zapata's impression be upon seeing the way subsequent regimes have adopted his figure and ideas? The truth is that without Emiliano Zapata and his work, the end of the Porfiriato would have unfolded differently, and the banners of agrarian reform would have been different. From a 21st century perspective, the fate of Zapata, of his natural anarchism, is, in essence, a tragic fate, in which history and the character move in opposite directions, and from death remains the symbol. And so Octavio Paz expresses it in The Labyrinth of Solitude. I open quotes. It is no coincidence that Zapata, a figure who possesses the beautiful and plastic poetry of popular images, has served as a model time and again for Mexican painters, with Morelos and Cuauhtemoc. He is one of the legendary heroes in which realism and myth ally in what his life was. Melancholic, fiery, and hopeful, who died as he lived, embraced by the earth. Like her, he is made of patience and fertility, of silence and hope, of death and resurrection. Because in the end, it was Zapata's unbreakable commitment, rooted in the failures of a political elite, that served to push him to carry out his revolution. One born out of frustration, from a nation that longed for a champion to lead their causes. Reynaldo Carrillo presents the New Encyclopedia. And thank you all for sharing our videos, for leaving your comments, for following us on our Instagram, and for collaborating with us on Patreon, which you can find below this video. Until next time, and may God bless you.